and which takes us to the next panel discussion. And the topic is building the future through infrastructure. And in the recent years, we are seeing higher and higher temperatures, and with every year exceeding the record for the one before. So do you know what role sustainability plays in infrastructure investment decision making? And what kind of infrastructure assets are investors most drawn to? So here to discuss investing in infrastructure assets and where the opportunities are in terms of long-term income generation are our panelists. Jan Brand, Director, Infrastructure and Natural Resources, Asia Pacific, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Kanish Bhatia, Head of Infrastructure, ARA Private Funds, ESR Group. Rajiv Vijay, Executive Director, Government and Infrastructure Advisory, Knight Frank, India, and Sharifah Bakar Ali, Head, ESG, UEM at Genta Berhad. And the moderator for this panel discussion is Deepto Roy, Partner, Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas.
Thank you very much, Kim. I would like to thank everyone for giving us this opportunity to be part of this panel, and to also welcome my fellow panelists. We are going to discuss infrastructure and the future. And the way I'm looking at it is that there is absolutely no doubt of the importance of investments and continued investments in infrastructure for building the future of Asia. $1.7 trillion annually, that's the number the Asian Development Bank thinks is required for infrastructure investments in the Asian region. And that's a significant number. At the same time, I think we are at a situation in history where the nature of infrastructure investing itself is changing. The asset classes that we traditionally identified as infrastructure and the risks that you would traditionally associate with those asset classes are changing today. Some assets which were considered stable and long-term yield gaining are being challenged today by principles of sustainability. And at the same time, we are looking at infrastructure investments into technology and the sort of the way in which technology is coming into infrastructure and has to be integrated into infrastructure is creating challenges as well as opportunities for investors. So let me start on that point and let me bring in my panelists, and perhaps Kanish, I will address the first question to you. What are you seeing as the key investment opportunities in infrastructure across the Asian region today?
Thank you. I think that's a fairly broad question, but I can start with the big picture and then maybe go a bit deeper. So I think big picture, we see significant opportunities in the Asian infrastructure market, given obvious trends which everybody's aware of. You mentioned a few, favorable macroeconomic drivers in terms of rising incomes, high growth rates, and large infrastructure deficits. And governments are quite stressed at the moment, given inflationary pressures and the pandemic impact. So we see tremendous opportunity for private capital. That's a great thing for infrastructure fund managers, APAC focus like ESR. So in terms of the specific opportunities, it clearly varies by country, as different Asian countries offer different market dynamics and regulatory frameworks. So just to give you a few examples, what we're seeing in India, we continue to see strong activity in the renewable energy space and also toll roads. In Vietnam, we're seeing opportunities in the onshore wind, solar, hydro space. In Indonesia, we're seeing opportunities in toll roads and wastewater treatment and certain mining-linked infrastructure assets as well. And if you move over to, say, Philippines, we've started seeing a number of digital infra assets and some midstream energy assets as well. I think overall, from our perspective, our infrastructure funds are more focused on developing Asian markets. This year has been outside India, I guess, has been pretty tough in terms of deal flow. Not many infra deals have closed outside India due to various reasons, including a large bid-ask spread. But long term, we are very positive given the favorable macroeconomic drivers I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Kanishk. And maybe Jan, I can turn to you now. And I know that OTPP has obviously been very active in the Asian market. Are you seeing, or can you identify specific policy markers that are identifying certain jurisdictions as being more attractive, or at least from your perspective, more worth looking at from an investment point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. And our strategy in APAC at Teachers is really spread across both developing Asia and developed Asia. And so I'll kind of speak to both. I think India is really the obvious example where there's been a huge driver towards building out the nation's infrastructure. It's been seen in improving tax legislation and simplifying tax legislation, expanding the use of InvITs, which are bring in a broad class of investors and a general welcoming of foreign capital. And you've seen this has driven substantial investment in roads and renewables principally, but also other investments like airports and utilities. Another place where we see this is in Australia, where there's been a huge shift in policies regarding the energy transition in the last 2 years, with every government across the country, state and federal level, except for Tasmania, having either re-elected or newly elected a Labor government, largely on the back of a public shift in sentiment favoring the energy transition and a growing frustration that Liberal parties were acting too slowly. So that gives you a sense of really the populist kind of driving policy change, which in turn the infrastructure investors are reacting to. This has rippled throughout multiple sector classes, including obviously renewables and other forms of energy, but electric utilities, smart metering, et cetera. On the other hand, there's actually also been a shift in the other direction in policies in Australia that are limiting investment. So for example, incoming tax legislation that's disproportionately hurting foreign investors, a growing anti-privatization sentiment within the country after nearly a decade of privatizations that really brought in a lot of foreign capital into the infrastructure sector. A couple other examples that I note, Indonesia, of course, there's been a massive increase or a massive desire to increase FDI, and you've really seen it in the roads sector, as Kanishk said, but also the telco sector, towers and fiber in particular. There's been a lot of activity in those two markets in the last couple of years. And going back to developed Asia, I think New Zealand has actually kind of gone a little bit in the opposite direction to Australia, where there's been a lot more private capital activity in New Zealand. That's largely driven by budget deficits, and a lot of the infrastructure is local council owned, and those local councils are really starting to feel the pinch given the cost of living increases over the last couple of years, driven by inflation and energy costs. That's really starting to drive more of a desire to bring in private capital, just given that funding crunch.
Thank you, Jan. And I think we have already sort of, moving into some specific themes. And of course, as I was mentioning, no conversation on infrastructure and the future of infrastructure investments can today avoid the question of sustainability and how, net zero goals across the world is driving a move towards, sort of development of assets in a particular manner. Sharifa, maybe I can bring you in at this point. Why don't, maybe you can give a brief introduction to Agenta and the work that you do there, and also talk us through on how you are seeing net zero goals, the move towards sustainability, how you are seeing that affect the investment environment.
Right. Thank you so much, Dipto. Thank you so much to Priya for bringing me to this panel discussion today. It's got two key topics which are my favorite, which is real estate and infrastructure. So allow me to give an introduction, and a very good afternoon to all my fellow panelists and to ladies and gentlemen. So allow me to give you a brief introduction of Agenta. So Agenta is an asset management company that provides facilities maintenance work across different asset classes. So we take care of the commercial building space. We take care of healthcare assets, and we also look after road transport network assets. We also provide engineering consultancy services. So we are headquartered here in Malaysia, and we've got presence in 5 countries, including Singapore and the UAE. Some of our iconic assets include the Prime Minister's office in our capital, diplomatic capital. We take care of 32 government hospitals in the north of Malaysia, north part of the country. We also maintain the longest expressway here in Malaysia, which is the North-South Expressway. And we take care of the Dubai Golf Club. So you can see an array of different assets that we take care. Now, sustainability is not new to us. We embed it in our practices because we take care of a lot of public assets. Let me share with you some of our practices. In the commercial built environment space, we work very closely with our clients to optimize energy consumption in assets that our clients own or assets that they occupy. Now, working very closely with our clients, we have implemented various energy efficiency and renewable energy solutions, which has enabled us to create a lot of green assets. A lot of these have received GBI and LEED status. We've enabled our clients to realize huge energy savings, more than 50% reduction in energy consumption as well as water consumption. And this has enabled our clients to reduce their carbon footprint. In the healthcare space, one of our work includes management of waste. We come in contact with huge amount of clinical toxic waste. In this regard, we work with healthcare providers to divert these away from landfills, and these are incinerated to reduce the impact it leaves on the environment. And in the infrastructure space, we embed circularity. Through research that we have pioneered, we are able to turn all road milling waste into environmentally friendly pavement materials, which we then use in our pavement rehabilitation works. Now, all this is not going to be made possible without a strong workforce. We have got a mature health and safety practice that places a lot of emphasis on the health and well-being of our people. Sustainability, the agenda is set right from the top. The board drives it through the senior management team, and policies are well cascaded across the organization. And so the move towards net zero is something that a lot of facilities management company, ourselves included, are beginning to respond to because of the impact that the built environment leaves on the environment. It today produces close to 40% of the emission of GHG emission, the built environment alone, right? And so just like many other facilities management companies, we are taking stock of our emission as well as our clients' emission. And very soon we will also be announcing our own net zero targets. That's how Dipto I see sustainability being practiced in the FM space and how we are responding to the climate crisis.
Thank you, Sharifah. And maybe Rajiv, I can bring you in here at the moment. And sort of the question that I have for you is that, how do you see this, the drivers towards net zero? What is the sort of the role that government policy will play in this? Is it more a government function? Is it a private function? Is it a combination? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Dipto. At first, my apologies. My throat quality is very bad today. I've been on travel for 4 days, and so please bear with my voice and frequent throat clearing, if you don't mind. So from my perspective, I think it's a joint responsibility of both the government and the private sector. Government is playing its bit. I think we all know, and I can say specifically, particularly about India, that they have very well-defined targets with achieving their net zero emissions by 2070, or targets that they've kept for the power sector in terms of renewable energy space. Forget about the renewable energy, even there has been a recent drive on working towards alternative fuels. So I've been seeing a very great implementation in the infrastructure sector towards these projects. Our renewable energy program has been going strong. We have been one of the countries which has picked up EV vehicles late, but of late, significant EV investments are happening across India, both in private car space as well as in the commercial space. At least within Knight Frank, you personally as a company, we have funded more than 2,500 to 3,000 electric buses in just last 1 year. So that's the pace of investments that's happening in these sectors. From the private sector side, when we talk of infrastructure and real estate together, the builders and the developer community has also taken it in a big way, both in the commercial real estate offices as well as so-called the back-end activities and warehouses. We have realized that unless we adopt ESG, no building is going to be sustainable in future, both front-end and back-end. So significant investments happening in India, increased use of technology in building construction, increased of technology and operations in warehousing space. And our experience has been that without this, even for local developers and builders, it's difficult to attract international funds to come and invest in these sectors. So very positive on this side. I can give you an example on the transportation side. We've had a very strong minister there who has been frequently advocating usage of alternative fuels. We're just talking of green hydrogen. We're talking of ethanol, methanol, EV. And India is going to be, is not going to be a single fuel or two fuel market. It's going to be a multiple fuels market. So with the kind of value-driven economy we have there, I'm sure these alternative fuels will play a big role. Yeah, even in the power sector, we have seen a huge amount of solar and wind energy that has come on the ground. Now we are looking at the wind plus solar model also, where when the sun is down, wind takes over, and we are able to better manage peaks. We have also seen now a very efficient of pump storage coming back into India. It was there earlier. It sort of lost its steam, but given the advantage of pump storage in managing peaks and troughs, all these methods are actually definitely helping India to reach towards its net zero target.
Thank you, Rajiv. And I think what's obviously effectively happening in India and across the region is that there is the confluence between infrastructure development and greening. And interestingly, what it's also doing is it's changing the nature of infrastructure assets, some cases quite fundamentally. So McKinsey in a report says that every sort of infrastructure investment, every infrastructure opportunity has to be now looked at through the lens of sustainability. And you can't avoid a conversation of sustainability if you're investing in infrastructure. And as I was saying, some asset classes which were considered stable, yield generating long-term, one example is gas pipelines, are today being considered again from the overall perspective of where that industry is heading. So maybe I'll bring in Kanish and then Jan. One is on the question of private capital and the sort of the restrictions that you are now facing in terms of fund deployment. Are you seeing a scenario where effectively more and more funding is going to come with sustainability bells and whistles? And how do you see that impacting your investment opportunities? And then maybe Jan, you can comment a bit on how you are seeing the sustainability debate or the sustainability question affect the asset classes that you're looking at, as well as the way you're looking at long-term risks with infrastructure projects.
So I think when you consider climate-related goals and decarbonization targets across Asia, that has definitely increased the investment opportunity set. Not just across renewables, but new sectors like EV value chain, and investor interest has definitely increased, which is a positive as a fund manager. And we're seeing infrastructure funds and LPs are paying a lot more attention to sustainability parameters, increasing restrictions when it comes to certain, older sectors, more traditional energy sectors like coal or oil and gas related investments. So, from our side, in line with these trends, we've recently set up an APAC focused sustainability and decarbonization linked infrastructure fund, and we're developing in-house renewable energy capability as well. But keeping all that aside, I think it's important when it comes to emerging Asia to take a more pragmatic view, because governments have a tough job of balancing climate goals on one hand and against budget constraints and economic realities on the other hand. So, for example, we think gas has an important role to play in Asia's energy transition story. It significantly reduces emissions in the short term, addresses the intermittency issues of renewables. But as you pointed out earlier, some investors are not too keen on the oil and gas sector investments for ESG reasons. We see that as an opportunity, as in less competition. So at ESR, we're taking a more pragmatic view, obviously looking at renewable energy projects, which is a big focus. But at the same time, we are keen to invest in gas to power projects, terminals, storage pipeline projects across Asia.
And
Yeah, sorry. No, I would generally agree with that. I think it's how we'd approach sustainability is very market driven. And you mentioned sustainability bells and whistles earlier. I think we've always looked at investments through a sustainability lens. I think what's changed in the last, call it 18 months, is that sustainability lens is really broadened, and you're no longer looking at, is this a coal-fired generator or a gas pipeline? You're now looking at the full value chain of an investment, and looking across that value chain at, which suppliers, which customers have strong net zero targets, which customers or which suppliers are exposed to fossil fuels, and that's as much driven from a moral or ESG imperative as much as it is a financial imperative, where we're really looking at the long-term sustainability of a business, and whether it's a customer or a supplier, what's the risk of that supplier or customer either fading into the background in the future or blowing up, and so that's really the lens that we're looking at things through, and absolutely we take a different view depending on whether we're looking at a developed market that probably has a greater ability to afford the energy transition versus a more developing market where there are going to be multiple solutions, and some of those a little less clean than others to get to that net zero target. The definition of infrastructure is absolutely changing, I think. You mentioned gas related infrastructure. There's obviously coal related infrastructure. I think also driven by cost of living crisis over the last couple of years with the energy spike and causing an inflation spike. That's actually also tested the thesis of most infrastructure having an inflation pass through. The reality is the inflation pass through only exists if your end customers can afford it and if the customer wallet is there to take on those increased prices. And many countries are facing cost of living pressures driven by energy spikes that's reducing infrastructure investors' ability to pass on higher prices, even if the contracts allow for them. And roads are a great example of that. At the other end of the spectrum, there's other asset classes that are moving towards core. Ganesh mentioned EV charging. The other one that I'd mention is smart meters, where historically you'd think that contracts are generally short and there's a lot of risk in those cash flows, but the sheer need for rollout of meters and the increased demand over the next 20 years reduces investors' expectations on things like churn as contracts roll off. So absolutely, I do think the definition is changing, and I think it's a bit more of a nuanced view on how you look at those sustainability risks, both from an ESG lens, but also from a financial returns lens.
Thank you. And I think sort of one of the dominant themes is the more and more influx of technology. And infrastructure today has to be two things. It has to be smart and it has to be sustainable. These are sort of the parameters with which most players are looking at the infrastructure sector. What it's also doing is because of, and I think Jan, you mentioned it, that there is a model lens as well. It's not just a lens of compliance. It's also a lens of where you would want your clients or where you would want your investee companies to be in. And the other interesting part of it is that it's introduced to the infrastructure sector players who are not traditionally in infrastructure, and sort of a major influx of big tech through a number of reasons. One is obviously their technology is being used in various developments, but equally most of them have taken very, very strong sustainability targets. And the result of that has been influx of several new players in the infrastructure investment scenario. Rajiv, what are you seeing in terms of high technology and how it's confluencing with, what was traditionally a relatively stoic sector?
Yes, so from my perspective, again, within the infrastructure space, people touch with infrastructure at several places. I mean, we work through transportation, we work through water, power, and gas, and all these sectors. Within each of these sectors, there has been a strong drive in using technology to improve operations, give better services to the customers, which is generally public, and use that to even create better revenue flows for the government. If I take specific examples, at the front end, let's say, when you're talking of airports or metros or road networks, within road networks, the moment the FASTag was introduced initially in 2017-18, it had a slow rollout. Now it's more or less 100% adopted. We are moving even away from FASTags, which even led to some queues development at toll plazas, to a system where nobody would have to stop at toll plazas. So that has kind of reduced delays at all the payment points, improved performance of roads and expressways. The trucks have to stop less at those facilities. In the case of passenger transport, the use of modern technology, not only in terms of the so-called digital side, but even on the physical side, the quality of trains that are coming into India and being manufactured in India has undergone a sea change. We are having newer systems are all coming with integrated platforms where you're going to be permitted to plan your journey from your home. So you don't have to buy independent tickets. Very soon in Delhi RRTS or Delhi Metro, you're going to see software assisting you in your travel journey from your home to work or whatever it is. So that's, again, adoption of technology. Nobody stops to buy tickets. Most of it goes through electronic systems. Even in terms of logistics, I think very few people are aware of it, that every container movement in India is not tracked, at least the export-import ones. And this has been going on for the last 3 or 4 years, covering all logistic parks, covering all ports, covering all toll plazas. The moment a container leaves a facility, it is tracked right from northern hills of India into Delhi, into train, onto port, and export from the port. So the government is using all of this data to do analytics and see where are the delays happening. Oh, this particular port is not performing well. We are getting delays at this container freight station or at this state border. So that's something that is very pleasing to note. From a sustainability and environment perspective, we've seen huge rainfalls in northern Delhi or northern India, huge amount of landslides and all of it. Government has already moved from constructing more roads into this region into ropeways, again bringing in modern European technology and bringing safe and sustainable transportation systems into India. So the list is long, Deepto, and I can talk hours about it, but it's a proper integration of hardware infrastructure and digital technology to make customer experience better. Somebody in the last webinar said that how important it is for people to attract to workplaces. And the government is currently focusing that your journey from home to work, you can build a very modern office or a very modern building, a great place to work. But every step on that value chain, whether it is your metro terminal, whether it is your airport, whether it is your roads, has to perform at that level with that level of technology to make all of these terminals also as great places to pass through, to enjoy, and be very comfortable in using them. So that entire value chain has to be improved, not just private real estate developers doing swanky buildings. Government is working towards it. And I'm sure, over a period of time, we'll see those results.
I think that's a very important point, Rajiv, and Sharifa, maybe I can bring you in here. One of the things that seems to be a dominant theme is that the community touch points with infrastructure is increasing. And one of the ideas for investors would be, as Rajiv said, to make that as comfortable as possible. The reason why there is so much investment going on in digital infrastructure is also similar in terms of the length of the commute, the more emphasis on work from home. Is future infrastructure going to have to be more community friendly? Sharifa, maybe I bring you in on that.
Right, Deepto, I like that question because it's touching the S in the ESG alphabet soup, or so we can say, right? Now, I always like to also approach questions like this from a context perspective. What's the composition of communities that we're looking at? These are people who commute to work. These are people who take public transportation. These are people who buy healthcare services, people who go into retail space, into malls. Now, I actually very much like the 15-minute city concept. Everything should be accessible. Basic necessities like healthcare, shopping needs, food should be accessible within 15 minutes by foot or by bike. And now the pandemic has actually shown us all how important it is for us to be able to reach all these basic necessities fairly quickly. So I foresee in infrastructure being built around this concept. I myself live in such a community where everything is reachable quite quickly, and it has actually saved me a lot of time from sitting in traffic. Infrastructure is also going to be responding a lot to lifestyle patterns and trends. Many of the Asian economies are experiencing an aging society phenomenon. And so infrastructure is increasingly going to be built taking into consideration this factor and allowing more access and mobility for people who use these infrastructure. Pandemic has also changed the way we live, and many of the previous panel members and we are also speaking about it now. We are working remotely. We are using community apps to purchase, to get food, to get ride share. I foresee for infrastructure being built to take into consideration this, and there being more space for curbside pickup, more space for people to actually wait for ride share. Now, these are some of the changes that I see happening within the infrastructure space. So a lot more investment is actually going to be tagged to social metric. It's not just going to be tagged to financial metric, but whether or not infrastructure is going to bring about better life quality, it's going to allow reduce poverty, allow more people access to basic needs. That's my view of how infrastructure is going to shape and how investment is going to actually be supporting it, Deepto.
Thank you, Sharifa. Conscious of time, and there is an audience question which I wanted to maybe I'll go to you, Jan, because sort of you raised a very important point about how the investment lens has to be both sort of from a regulatory perspective as well as a moral perspective. And how would a country's attitude towards, sort of ESG policies or climate change, how is that going to impact the overall impression of the country? So the question is, the audience question is around the recent nuclear waste, decisions by Japan. And the question is that, does that impact the whole country's image negatively? And how would you look at that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think to one degree, it almost doesn't matter, because I think what we're seeing across the world is where governments are failing to deliver on ESG outcomes or moral outcomes, the private sector is actually delivering it instead. And that's really driven by the nature of the capital coming in. I don't know what the percentage is, but probably the vast majority of private investment capital is coming from pensioners. And pensioners tend to be on the more liberal end of that spectrum. And so where governments are failing, everyone's seeing the tides of change. And so where governments are failing, the private sector is stepping in and saying, I'm going to do this anyway, and force a good return through that investment. So to one extent, the government's policies don't matter. Of course, if the government's policies are prohibitive, then that's absolutely going to matter. The Japan example is an interesting one, because I do think that there is a bit more of a voting with your dollars or voting with whatever currency you're investing in mentality when it comes to investing, that you can put social pressure and you can put political pressure on a country by directing your capital elsewhere. And you are seeing that increasingly so across the world. And a great example was the war over the last 2 years, where basically the US used a tool that it had never used before through not only sanctions, but actually prohibiting, pulling investments, and that translated not only into, okay, direct investments into Russia, we can't make those investments, but we actually looked beyond that, and do you have a main customer who's based in Russia, and is that 10% of your investment, or is some of your suppliers in Russia, indirect, and then indirect to the second degree, related to a country and the geopolitical risks associated with that? I think you're seeing that increasingly so with China and China versus the Western powers, and people are starting to ask those questions about China. So absolutely, I do think that the capital that private investment brings can absolutely influence policy.
Thank you, Jan. And I think the last part of the session, let's talk a little bit about the challenges. And one of the challenges that you have identified, and that's critical, particularly for long-term investments in infrastructure, is the geopolitical risk. Kanish, if I may bring you in here, and how do you approach such a situation? How do you approach a situation such as a war or the technology battlefield that has now opened up between China and the United States?
Look, I think regulatory political risks have always been, areas you have to navigate as an infrastructure and manage as an infrastructure investor. We are essentially buying assets that provide essential services, have monopolistic characteristics. So we've been doing this for a long time. It's just that at the moment, or in recent times, geopolitical tensions have definitely increased. So it does make it more challenging to invest in certain countries or invest capital from certain countries. But I think infrastructure, in some ways, the sector is not unique, because geopolitical tensions are impacting lots of companies and sectors. Look at semiconductors and other industries as well. So it's our, I guess, part and parcel of investing in infrastructure. So we're probably a bit more used to managing these risks. I think for certain companies, certain sectors which were not previously impacted by these with geopolitical issues, it's a new sort of experience and a steep learning curve. But I think as infrastructure investors, we've always managed these risks.
No, I think that's an important point, because of the significant sort of government touch points in any infrastructure sector. The political risk was always, including things like regime change or electoral change, have always been part of the playbook, so to speak. Let's talk about China for the moment. And I know that, sort of, Jan, you touched upon the fact that, the increased tension with China is causing some issues, but equally there's a lot of concern around the Chinese economy itself, right? And there seems to be a perception that economy is rapidly sort of declining. And what does that mean for investments in the region? And is that really a concern, or is it something that the market will adjust to? Jan, if I can bring you in on that.
Sorry, can you just repeat that last bit of the question?
What impact would a potentially declining Chinese economy have on infrastructure investments, not just in China, but across the region?
Yeah, well, I think across the region, most countries are interconnected with China to either a direct degree or an indirect degree, whether it's a major export market for that country, or its supply chain is largely reliant on China. And so I do think it's going to have a ripple effect across the region, across the world, as things slow down. I do think there's going to be opportunities coming out of it. I think, we've seen over the last couple of years, India has been a big beneficiary of a move away from the Far East. And I think we'll continue to see that going forward. It's just got the demographics behind it that really should push it forward. I think Indonesia is another great example where it's right on the cusp of that, demographic dividend, in the same way that China was a couple decades ago, and really can use that to its advantage, coupled with policy changes to increase FDI and really build out its infrastructure. both in the physical infrastructure, but also across the value chain when it comes to manufacturing and labor. So I do think it's going to be very, very impactful. Should it be sustained? Yeah.
And
so, if I may add a little bit to that question from a sustainability perspective. So just in 2022, the amount of sustainable investing that was circulating in the economy was more than $1 trillion. Half of that amount actually came from China. So while it may be showing some slowing down, it is actually ramping up a lot on the decarbonization strategies and solution. And also in our own business as well, I spoke about our technology to recycle milling waste. The technology is actually coming from China as well, right? So in my opinion, I think that we are going to actually be seeing a lot more solutions that the Chinese are being able to offer, and that's a great benefit to companies that have set net zero target, because a lot of how we reach our target is actually getting to the available solutions to decarbonize.
no, thank you.
If I may just add on China, I mean, I think the current sentiment, news flow is obviously quite negative and bearish, but I think it's important to appreciate that China remains a large exporter of capital in the Asian region, especially in Southeast Asia. And Chinese EPC construction companies are actively investing and developing infrastructure projects across Asia. We have been a big beneficiary of that. Earlier this year, ESR Group announced $1 billion ASEAN-focused infrastructure fund, largely with Chinese capital. So I think the news and the sentiment may be negative, but the ground reality is that China is continuing to invest heavily in the region.
No, and that's, I think, maybe just the last concluding point. And I heard a number of the panelists touch upon inflation and the increased cost of infrastructure. And equally, countries like China and India are continuing to spend and will spend very significant amounts on infrastructure itself from the government, not just from the private sector. So maybe Rajiv, some thoughts on how you would look at government spending, particularly from the lens on whether it will drive inflationary pressure, or would it be something that will start a cycle of investment which will actually help bring utility costs down?
Sure, Deepto. So I can only say it for India as of now, so not for other countries in Asia. From an India perspective, I can say that what the government contractors or private developers have realized over a period of time that executing a project on time is the biggest requirement. And as long as you can manage a project well within time, inflationary pressures can be safely managed. Obviously, there have been few disruptions around COVID period and which affected the supply chains, but I think situation is back to normal. We are having softer commodity prices as of now, and I think within the infrastructure space, both government and private parties as stakeholders have worked jointly that all the necessarily approvals are in place before the project is executed. I mean, 2 decades ago when we started PPP program in India, 2004-5, PPP used to be like initial lot of pain because there's not necessary approvals on ground to push the infrastructure project. The developer had to go through patience and persevere. I mean, that was my definition of PPP: pain, patience, and persevere. Now it's changed. Now it's perform, play the game, and go for peaks. I mean, we are looking at significant peaks in transportation demand, in power supply requirements, even in logistics space, as the economy is growing. We are looking at these peaks happening in India. India has never been short of demand. There has always been a pent-up demand for infrastructure. The moment you open it, it gets used. So the system has to gear up for that. And I think government has realized it, and they know that all these pressure points have to be managed. good that global supply chain is back to normal. And so I feel that these investments by government is going to reduce inflation as we bring down the logistic costs. In terms of even technology interface to it, I don't know how many global governments have it, but India is now building the unified logistics interface platform, which means connecting all modes, all private players, all ministries, customs, railways, roadways, and bringing all of them into one platform where every logistic supply chain member is connected to. So it's like, Amazons or Olas and Ubers of logistics. And I'm sure that will drive down the logistic cost and
Indian,
overall costs. Yeah.
UPI as a very similar sort of, well, not similar, but an integrated, overreaching kind of technology platform. Look, we are out of time, and we can continue this. We could have continued this conversation for a much longer time. I think all I can say is thank you to all my colleagues on this panel. We have touched on a dizzying array of topics, and all that kind of establishes is that it's an exciting time to be a professional in the infrastructure sector. There's so many confluences coming together.
Yes.
Sector is changing beyond recognition in some ways and staying the same in others. Thank you very much, and thank you again to the APRIA team. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dipto and panelists. A very interesting discussion. So a key component to infrastructure development is, of course, energy. And the amount of energy required in infrastructure development is massive. And this has become a concern in climate management, both for the governments and private sectors. And renewable and more sustainable energy programs are being adopted across the region through increased adaptation of technology, and this is changing the landscape of infrastructure investments. More funding is being channeled into sustainability. At the same time, there has to be a balance in distribution among traditional energy options like gas and fuel, and it comes down to affordability and feasibility depending on how developed the nation is. The use of technology certainly helps to improve efficiency, and the integration of sustainable resources and digitalization can reduce the touch points in the community, thereby contributing to a more sustainable environment. And despite the negative situation in China, she is still a heavy investor in infrastructure, not just within China, but also in the Asian region. And this is expected to continue. Well, we're now halfway through the webinar, so it's time to take a short break. So please go and grab yourself a coffee and do come back in 10 minutes. See you in a bit.